Hello and welcome back to episode 3, I believe. This is of the Dutiful Future show. Today I have a fantastic and very special guest, Mr. John Chilvers.
Good morning.
Hello, thank you so much for coming on. I'm very excited. Would you like to introduce yourself? What do you do? Anything about yourself?
Yes, great to be here. My name is Jonathan Chilvers. I am an elected county councillor on Warwickshire County Council. I represent Leamington, Brunswick, which is kind of that south of the river bit where maybe over 1,000 students live in the area I represent. So I may well be your county councillor. And it's great to be back. I'm a graduate from Warwick University more years ago now than I care to remember. I studied history and politics.
Yeah, we had a fantastic conversation outside about the political theory from Hobbes module, if any of us do that. For somehow it hasn't changed too much in the not very long time since Mr. Chilvers was here. Anyway, so today we're going to be talking primarily about Green Party politics, as of course John is a Green Party representative, about the future of Green politics in the UK, specifically of the party, and also just of the future. So I think we can start this off straight away. John, what are your core values as a politician, both Leamington and as a wider, in a wider scope?
Yes, so the Green Party is obviously best known for kind of environmental values and how we can live within our means on our planet and kind of what that outworks. But the outworking of that covers, all of economics and politics. So it's kind of an underlying green philosophy that spreads out into kind of all areas. And there's some other key things for the Green Party in the UK, and that is a focus on social justice, how we radically change things to make it better for the least well-off in our society, and also the principle of non-violent direct activism. So we're very much a think and do party. So those are probably some of the key things.
Okay, very interesting. So in I believe it was 17, it was last year actually, Parliament declared a climate emergency in the United Kingdom. What are your opinions on the climate crisis? Do you believe we are in the midst of a crisis? And if so, what are the, I would say, top 3 things that need to be done in order to try and begin to curtail, this sort of, I guess, crisis?
Yeah, so I definitely think we're in a crisis. I think we've known about the challenge and the threats of climate change for a long time, but we've wasted so many years. And we've over the last kind of 20 years, we've had little peaks of interest, but as a society, we've never really got to grips with the kind of the sheer scale of what we need to change. And so now we're on a knife edge. And actually, we know that some of the climate change is built in. So whatever we do now, we're still going to need to adapt quite considerably to the climate. So I would say that's actually one of the first things that we need to do, regardless of anything else. We need to think about how we adapt in the run-up. There's 10 million homes at risk down the east coast of England. We face a internal refugee crisis in over the next generation, and so adaptation and looking at what that means for us as a society would be number one thing to look at. Number 2, obviously, is how do we, as a country and as our planet, get to carbon neutrality? And there's a huge range of things we need to look at. And it's very easy for people to get caught up on little things they can see, which I think is important. So, whether you turn the light off or whether you what mode of transport you take on a particular journey. But there's also some really big underlying things like where we invest our pensions, which potentially can have a huge impact on kind of the structure of the world economy, if you like, and the energy how we produce our energy.
So it's more than just a individual problem. It's not just putting your can of Diet Coke in the bin. It's an institutional and a broader economic thing that needs to be shifted.
Yeah, and so sometimes I think we, like at the county council at the moment, we're kind of scoping what emissions are used by the county council as an organisation and by the whole of Warwickshire as a whole. And sometimes people get hung up on, well, if we used a bit less paper, we would save 100 tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. And I'm saying, yeah, but you could spend thousands of pounds doing that, whereas the carbon emissions produced by all the vehicle journeys on our A roads and minor roads in Warwickshire is over 1 million tonnes.
Oh, okay.
And so it's kind of that scope. And so just trying to look at it and go, okay, where are our quick wins? Where can we make a really big impact? If we could take 1% of vehicle journeys off the road in Warwickshire, that would save us 10,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide.
Okay, very interesting. So it's not just about doing everything that we can see that we can. It's about doing things that are smart. It's about solving the problem in a smart way. I think it's important at this point to recognise that me and John agree probably on most of this stuff, but I'm going to be playing devil's advocate. Yes. So I'm going to have to ask the very basic question, which I think is quite prominent, particularly in online sort of conservative circles. Is the UK not already doing very well? So fossil fuels produce less than half of the UK electricity. Scotland is on path to be entirely reliant on fossil fuels. 2018 UK emissions were 44% below 1990 levels. And the UK seems to be, at least specifically on fossil fuels, quite ahead of Europe and the other countries who are prioritising these issues. Do you think we're doing enough, or do you think that perhaps other countries need to pull their weight in a sense?
Yeah, there's lies and damn lies and statistics, aren't there? And the key damn lie under that figure is that we've outsourced so much of our carbon dioxide emissions through outsourcing our manufacturing to China and other places. And so it's all very well saying that, yeah, we're no longer burning so much many emissions, but we need to factor in the entire cost, carbon cost of our living standards, whether that's meat eating or what we produce, and that actually helps us to think about this on a global scale rather than just fixing our own backyard.
Perhaps it's not just a production model of climate change we need to care about, it's also a consumer model. So the fact that we, as you said, the manufacturers moved across, the fact that we demand so much is incurring this greater issues in other countries.
And you were saying about solving some of these issues in a smart way. The stuff we buy and the services we buy need to the cost of those need to reflect the true cost to our planet, and because otherwise we're just building a debt up for future generations. I've got 2 children. Every time that I go on a journey or buy something that the true cost isn't reflected when I buy that product, I am building up giving them a debt that they're going to have to deal with, and that's going to be very difficult for them. So
would you believe that? So as you say, with specifically the issue of manufacturing going abroad, would you place the ownership on solving this problem in terms of the UK putting more international pressure on other countries to improve their green productions, and that's sort of more of an external factor, or would you say that it's more of a thing with internal the UK that we need to start not buying things from certain places and sort of let the market dictate?
I would say that we are in a position to ask to see that entire supply chain. So when we buy products into this country, and this could be the UK government post-Brexit, we've got an opportunity to make a different trade policy. We could demand stronger evidencing of our supply chains, which would look at the massive companies around the world who say, well, you can't trade here unless you're showing us the true cost of the products you're producing, and that's an environmental and a social justice issue. And I think big companies are just beginning to think about kind of some of the provenance of where their materials come from, and we need to really continue to push that.
Could be perhaps a similar model to pre-Bill Clinton, trade policy, which was you only trade with countries if they align with your certain moral values, which he kind of abandoned when he opened up trade routes quite prominently with China. Perhaps we need to adapt our sort of trade policies to be more in terms of, okay, we'll trade with you, but you need to align with these certain, green policies in terms of, for example, carbon reduction.
I'm a pragmatist, so I wouldn't. There's certain countries that are just like completely beyond the pale, but most countries I would want to kind of, in a negotiation format, and saying, well, it's about what are our priorities and what we're asking for at that negotiation table, and we can see where we can take that. And if we prioritise things like, as I say, greener supply chains, then that can have a big impact. But it's not just, we all know that there's hugely influential multinational companies around the world, so it's not purely about negotiating with individual countries.
Could you not say that, though, for example, who are the two top countries in pollution is China and America, I believe?
Yeah.
Could you say that they're probably the two least likely you'll ever be able to agree to at least even something as basic as being more transparent in terms of that supply chain? So could you say if that is not something that's particularly possible, or assuming that it's not particularly possible, surely any attempts could simply be seen as a drop in the water?
Yeah, but we've got to engage with those countries because they are the biggest one, and we've got to recognise that, you know, we're not the most powerful country in the world, but that's not to say that we can't have an international presence and an international influence, and it's what we use that influence for that I think is important.
So specifically back to the UK again, the UK has current 2050 targets for things like carbon neutrality. Yeah. Do you think that that's too far away, or would you say that's a reasonable goal, but we're not doing enough to reach that?
No, I think it's too far away.
Okay.
I would want to aim for a 2030 carbon neutral target in this country. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of the psychology of how politicians work, if you put a target any further in the future, it's just like, oh, well, we'll leave that for the next guys. And, you know, it is a crisis. It's an emergency. The science is telling us that that's where we need to get to. I'll bet, the best approximation we have, no model is perfect, but that's what we need to aim for. And yeah, it is a huge challenge. It would mean an incredibly fast change in our society over the next decade, but that's what we need to do. This should be akin to being on a war footing. Mm-hmm. And as a country, we achieved more in that 5 years in terms of technology development and production of planes and all those things. So that is how we should be viewing this. And actually, I think it's something in this kind of very divisive post-Brexit or Brexit period, the fight against climate change is something that could bring us together as a country, because we need the brightest and the best people to be tackling this problem. So I don't want our brightest and best people to be spending their years in the arms trade, which, we're the second largest arms. I want, if I was in the government, I'd be going and sitting down to those companies and saying, we're going to start tightening what you can do on arms. Mm-hmm. We're, export licenses, all that kind of stuff. That's going to go over the next couple of years. But we want to help you transition and take your best people to face this massive challenge of climate change.
One could even compare it to similar to, I believe it's Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez's message in the USA, where it's the Green Industrial Revolution. And I think that was part of Corbyn's campaign. But anyway, so that's sort of particularly appealing, as you said, as a unifying force. I think a lot of people would generally accept that one of the driving forces behind Brexit was, loss of jobs and that sort of feeling left behind by current economic systems. And you could say that a green industrial revolution and making so many more jobs for these sorts of people and in these sort of sectors could be a very important way of uniting the country around something so important.
Absolutely. And the jobs market is always changing, and people are always nervous about how the jobs market is changing. But I think we can definitely, and again, it's about how we do some of this stuff. So, for instance, insulation to reduce energy it's not the most glamorous thing to talk about, but it is something that potentially could produce quite a lot of jobs and training. And likewise, I would like to see us reduce tax on employment, but increase tax on stuff. So again, it's about reflecting that true cost of things, and that encourages job creation. And so when you then look at kind of how the throwaway society and how we encourage, it makes it stuff cheaper to mend stuff, because if you're creating jobs in doing that and making it more the materials more expensive in the first place, and that again is job creation.
Very interesting. Okay. So there's a amazing study by, I believe it's Markowitz, done relatively recently, which basically tried to investigate the separation between when you ask people, do you believe climate change is man-made? And it's generally, there's very few people who would deny that it's man-made or deny that it exists entirely. And the difference between them saying, all right, so what would you want to do about it? Would you vote on action, or would you actually do things yourself? And there's a quite prominent, there's a gap between the first two statements in terms of, I think there's a problem, but I don't want to do anything about it, but also saying the attitude-behaviour gap where I want to do something, but I can't. And they addressed a number of issues, which were things like guilty bias, so people think they're to blame, and they say, oh, it can't be that bad, because they assume, oh, if they're responsible, they want to downplay the problem. There was things like, distance horizons, it seems like it's so far away. The difficulty of understanding blameless action, so they don't think there's anyone really to blame.
Yep.
So how do you really tackle it? Do you see any problem in these sort of specific issues amongst individuals in order to convince them to vote on action and actually put these issues right in the front and actually into government?
This is what I think good politics is about providing leadership and vision about where we need to go as a society. And I think people want to do the right thing, if it generally speaking, but they need to know that other people are also doing the right thing. It's kind of that competitive instinct we have as a species. We don't want, and we need to have a sense of where we're going together. And to me, that's what we as that's our job as politicians, to provide that vision and leadership, and to say we can do this. It's going to be difficult, but we can all go on that journey together. So, yeah, and climate change is a particularly difficult problem in that psychological sense, as you've outlined, because it seems so far away, it seems like an individual's actions are so small, and people are all saying, oh, well, we don't know if any one particular thing whether incident is climate change. So, yeah, it's difficult for all those reasons, but it's not insurmountable.
Okay. There was another study, I believe, by Kennedy, which, amongst a similar issue, essentially asked people, why aren't you doing things about climate change? And the number one answer was time and money. Yeah. And their conclusion was essentially the best way to get, at least specifically individuals, to do things is to improve their standard of living. And perhaps the best way to actually give people this time and give people these funds, or the feeling that they are secure enough to act, is to improve an economy. And that's where you could fall down perhaps the more, I can't remember the exact person who made the argument, but I think it's a more right-leaning argument, which is to say the only way to solve this problem is to not sacrifice GDP. We have to have a strong economy, and then we can solve these problems by giving us the time or the energy to not. Would you say that we have to sacrifice some form of economic growth, or would you say that those two things can be congruent and they can go together?
I think if you go too far down that line, you end up tying yourself in knots, to be honest. So I think there's... Climate change, as I say, is going to happen whether we like it or not. And if we don't do anything about it, it will happen in a catastrophic way, which will be very, bad for people's standard of living.
A real shame.
Indeed, yeah. Yes, a classic British understatement. Or we can try and manage that change, and again, this is come back to the role of government, isn't it, to make it as least bad as possible. So that it doesn't answer your question directly, but we've just got to provide the financial incentives for people, so it makes it easy to make the right decision. And as we've seen, I know people talk about the plastic bag tax, but it was a tiny financial incentive that had this massive impact. So if we apply that in other places, that can work. And I also think it's possibly about changing the framing of the argument in terms of GDP. It's about, well, what's GDP for? Actually, it's about our own happiness and well-being. So let's chuck GDP, which is a pretty awful measure of wealth, out the window, and say, well, as a society, we want to pursue other ways of measuring how well we're doing. And of course that includes includes a financial, there's quite a lot of evidence to show that people need a certain standard of living. I think it's about £25,000 a year in this country to feel kind of comfortable and happy, and actually above that, people's happiness doesn't increase. It begins to rely on other factors. So I think we need to reframe the argument.
One could say that perhaps the impending doom of humanity, as we see it, should be included in our economic analysis. Okay, I'm going to go to a song now on our very first break. This has been a very good first segment. The first song is going to be Khalid's song 11, Enjoy. Fine song. Unfortunately, they've taken out my favourite song, which I've played every single week so far, and I'm very upset.
Oh, no.
I'm very sad. Back to more important things than my love of Tyler, the Creator. We're going to move on to our next topic, which is still related to the Green Party, and this is specifically about the governmental situation in Austria. In Austria, there's been a coalition formed very recently between the Conservative Party in Austria and the Green Party. This was quite controversial because the Conservative Party, the OVP, I believe, or it might be because it's 2 dots over the O, known as the People's Party, they are been dubbed one of the most right-wing parties in Austria. And their they were in government previously, and their coalition partners were the very anti-immigration, hardline, far-right party. And this was obviously seen initially by green activists across Europe saying, "Oh, this is a great victory. We've got a voice in government. This is an important thing." But there became an instant conflict in a sense, because in order to go into government with Kurz and his OVP party, the Greens have had to give up some of their core values, specifically around immigration and social policy, in favour of taking pretty actually advanced climate opinions. For example, Austria's ahead of the UK in this. They want to be climate neutral by 2040. And they want to decrease, petrol-powered cars and everything. Something by 2030, they want nearly entirely all their electricity to be from renewable sources. And I guess the basic question is, would you be willing in the UK, or what is the price of the Green Party having a real say in government?
Well, first of all, I don't think that going into coalition means you lose your values. So it's about a hard-nosed negotiation about what you're going to be able to do, and it's about weighing those risks and benefits. And so I think nailing down a coalition agreement is something that in most of European countries they're a lot better at than we are in this country. So basically, I think the Liberal Democrats got well and truly screwed in 2010, and because they didn't nail down what they wanted, they weren't clear about what their priorities were and what they were absolutely going to do, and they weren't clear about when they were allowed to disagree within the coalition. And so, to me, it's about nailing down what is and is not going to happen. And so, for instance, I don't think the Liberal Democrats were wrong to go into coalition in 2010, but I do think they were, looking back, they were very, very naive, and they didn't. Well, in this country, we just don't have a history of doing that kind of agreement. So that's kind of a bit of the background. And so I haven't read that coalition agreement. In parts of it may not even be public, but I think there's nothing wrong with going into coalition if you're really clear that, yeah, actually, we're being pragmatic. We're getting a huge amount out on green infrastructure and stuff. We don't agree with the immigration stuff, but we are still able to say that we don't agree with certain bits, and be clear that we are lobbying for change within our coalition, from that position of power.
I would say that in Austria, at least specifically at this point, it seems like they've taken a very clear stance very early on. I mean, the main slogan of their first speech together was "Protect our climate and protect our borders." Whether things can get bogged down in certain areas is a bit different, but there are very clear points in which the coalition agreement has been nailed down, and that has been on very anti-immigration, nearing towards closed borders, very anti-refugee, very anti-migrant in almost any form. And the Green parties were one of the largest criticisms of Kurz's previous government, particularly for a lot of the policies that he is still espousing to continue. And I would say that essentially the Green Party have basically accepted, as you pointed out earlier, part of the Green Party's core, at least in the UK, is not just green politics, it's also social justice and those sort of issues. Do you not think that, at least in Austria and potentially in the UK, that sacrifice in terms of things where immigration will most likely be included, is it worth it? Is that something which is reasonable or even moral to do, considering they are one of the harshest critics of these policies, and they consider them, they called them things such as inhumane, but now they are passively supporting them in the sense where up on that stage they together said protect our borders and protect our climate, and endorsed these very strict policies in terms of deportation and in terms of refugees.
Yeah, as I say, I don't know a lot of the details. It makes me uncomfortable to think that you're in that position, but I'm not, without knowing the details, I'm not going to say that it's the right or the wrong thing. I'm saying it's a high risk thing to do. It's to go into any coalition with a smaller party. It's a high risk thing to do because you do run that risk of kind of getting swallowed up, if you like, and so. But for instance, so the Green Party have the justice portfolio within that government, so they will probably be hoping to ameliorate the policies, and at some level they're having to say, where can we have the most influence? Are we going to have the most influence as an outsider party speaking in, or are we going to have the most influence on the inside? And I say it's how you set up that framework that's really important, and I don't know whether the Green Party of Austria have done that in a way that I would agree or not. But I just think that politics is messy. It is really difficult to be clear on, to figure out the best way of meeting your priorities. And certainly, I don't know if you want me to talk about in this country, for instance, I find it very difficult to imagine a situation where the Green Party would be in any kind of coalition with the Conservative Party in this country, purely because if we sat down and worked through those priorities, they just wouldn't match up in a way that allowed us to. But that's not to say that I wouldn't start that conversation, because there are people within the Conservative Party that care a lot about climate change, and there are still, believe it or not, One Nation Conservatives in the Conservative Party, particularly at local government level, actually. And so I wouldn't not have that conversation. And of course, there's various levels of cooperation as well. We're now a bit more familiar in this country with the idea of confidence and supply agreements, and that kind of thing, or agreement on a case-by-case basis. And so the Green Party are very clear that we want to reach out to other parties and do politics differently and find the points of agreement and interest where we can work together while still being really clear. So, right, we can agree on this bit, but actually this bit we're just too far apart, and we're going to happy to be that outsider voice speaking in.
Could you not say that, as was established in the first segment, this is a crisis. This is the pending doom of humanity. So to prompt it as a hypothetical, if the Conservative Party came to you, say you were in charge of the Greens, they came to you tomorrow and they said, right, here's the deal. You ditch all of your social justice rhetoric, you ditch all of that. We will take on ambitious and progressive climate policies in specific areas, but you have to be in line with us in these ways, and you have to vote with us. Would you not surely snap at the chance if the climate is as such, as you say, a knife edge on it is? Surely abandoning some ideologies or some ideals around things like immigration is a necessary sacrifice in order to steer us away from sheer destruction.
Well, as we've already talked about, climate change and how we live within our means on the planet and social justice are intrinsically linked. So we wouldn't just better say ditch the social. That makes no sense. I'd probably, if somebody came to me and said that, I'd say, Well, that's an interesting conversation opener. Let's get down to some hard-nosed negotiation and see where we get to. And I think it's about understand in that situation, as in in a business deal situation, it's understanding what power you have and what your risks are, and how much do the other party need you, how far you can push them to get the things that you want. And it's about understanding that power dynamic, and I don't think it's something that we talk about enough in politics or in business or in society, about understanding what power we do have, what influence we can have, and then how we play our cards to meet those kind of underlying values and priorities that we have.
You've spoken a lot about this hard-nosed negotiation, but everyone knows that in a negotiation you've got to give something up. So I guess the natural question is, which of your core values would you be willing to give up in order to have the Green Party have a real impact in terms of policy, in order to actually make a difference in terms of, very specifically on policy and in government, in terms of things like, as you said, bringing the the targets closer to now, actually ensuring that we do more, putting this, and even simply putting the message out in it from a greater standpoint. What would you be willing to have to leave on that table?
I don't think it's about leaving your values. I think it's about trying to find ways of achieving things that you can all agree on. And you're not going to be completely happy with anything, but normally it's about the speed or the rate of progress rather than a fundamental disagreement. So, I mean, at the moment, I'm part of the climate change cross-party group at Warwickshire County Council. That is a Conservative-run administration. I'm pushing for that report about what the county council does to be as advanced as possible, and push as hard as I can. And I have a number of options that I can do. I can stay on board inside that group and accept that I'm getting somewhere, but the progress isn't as fast as I'd want, or I could step outside and be a complete outsider, or try and find a way of doing a bit of both. So it's that's what I'm doing every day within politics, is how do I move, which of my tools that I have available do I move those priorities forward?
To go back to try and get it down to more specifics, I would say that the number one thing, at least in Austria, and most likely would be on the cards in the UK, would be something like immigration. If, say, the Conservative Party came to you exactly today, and they said, right, here's everything you want in terms of climate, but our immigration policy is going to be exactly what it is now, in terms of what they want to implement. And in terms of things like hard Brexit and reducing borders and increasing borders, do you see immigration as something you would be willing to say, all right, fine, we'll accept a more conservative standpoint on immigration, so that the UK personally can become more climate, progressive?
So, first of all, you have to take a party along with you. So, whatever I... Of
course.
And secondly thing to say is that I don't think the Conservatives still know what they want their immigration policy to be. So it might be a bit difficult to negotiate with them on that one. So I think there's on immigration, there's certain... So at the moment, there's this discussion about how we make sure that our EU nationals that have lived here for so long, how we make sure that they are... they can be confident in their status. And for instance, so even within the framework the Conservatives are setting down, there's still things that the Green Party would want to push for. Should we offer them all British nationality free if that's what they want? But then once we've left the European Union, and once we have we've done Brexit, or the first bit of Brexit, we all know that there's a lot more of Brexit to come, then we have to accept that even if that's not what we wanted, and the freedom of movement within Europe has gone, we will have to accept that as a party and as a country. And so your starting point unfortunately changes. So I wouldn't be in a radical, let's go completely back the other way. We've got to adapt to the new thing and say, how do we apply our values of freedom of movement, of care for refugees? How do we apply it in this new environment that we're in, whether we like that environment or not? And so, yeah, I would go and negotiate on that basis. So I wouldn't say exactly what, but freedom of movement, or I think there's an underlying principle here on immigration about that. Are we valuing other people's lives in other countries around the world as much as we are ours? Do we really understand why people want to be economic migrants? People don't generally want to leave their family and their country, but they feel so often that they have no choice. And if we can look at free movement of people through that lens and say, okay, how can we support what the wants and needs of people around the world? So how can we support, I don't know, Poland or Central European people to be an economy, a place where people want to live? And how can we see that through other people's eyes? You know, it's walking a mile in other people's shoes. And that's what, regardless of what agreement or anything that very hypothetically we're talking about, is to bring that to a discussion and have that kind of empathy. And I think some of the policies might change, and how we do international aid might change when we kind of view things through that lens.
Do you not recognise a sort of almost a separation between the first segment where, you know, as I said earlier, it's a crisis, it's a knife edge, to a sort of more, a less hard-nosed, I would be willing to give certain things up, because, you know, perhaps the best, in terms of immigration, perhaps the best way to help the rest of the world is to improve our climate policy so that we don't burn in a matter of 10 years.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a sort of, perhaps there's a sort of a disconnect in the Green Party and perhaps in general with how big of a problem we see it as, and what we would be willing to give up, in a sense? Or
yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, but an important one to ask, because, as you said, like, politics is about priorities, like, and that's what you've been kind of driving at. And obviously, if I'm my set of asks, if I'm in any negotiation, climate change is all, but climate change in a way that delivers social justice, both nationally and internationally, is always going to be at the top. So yeah, you are not going to get all the things you want, but I think those other things, again, a lot of it is about speed and type of progress rather than being dichotomically opposite. And I think it's trying to find those win-wins, or the things that you can live with. But yeah, priorities, that's how a negotiation works.
Very interesting. Okay, I'm going to go to our second break and our second song. This is Fickle Friends with Pretty Great. And we are back. Woo, that was a fun second segment there. It got quite exciting, particularly spicy for a climate change segment. So we're going to have a nice little bit of a slightly more relaxed third part, talking about the role of the Green Party and should they exist. Far less
the
direct.
Existential challenge.
the existential crisis of the Green Party. No. So our final segment is simply just going to be on the role of third parties. At the end of your hustings speech for the last MP election, you talked about why you should vote third party, even if people don't believe that they're never going to win. And I'm simply going to pose the question: are third party spoiler candidates, and are they wasted votes?
Well, that's an extremely loaded way of talking about the democratic process, isn't it? But let's start there. So,
a little bit of democracy, just a little bit.
So in the political process, what I find interesting is that politicians and political parties pore over how people vote. It's quite, a lot of people don't give a huge amount of thought to who they vote for. You know, there's surveys that show that like 11% of people walking to a polling booth not knowing who they're going to vote for, but political parties, they're counting every vote. And so what I would say is that every time that somebody votes Green, it is having a positive influence on public policy, on what happens and what other political parties are going to say. So there is no such thing in that sense as a wasted vote, because every time you vote Green, you are having an impact. And we've seen that, like in Warwick District locally, prior to this May, there was only one Green councillor, and I think we got maybe 11% of the vote over Warwick District as a whole. In May, we went to 8 councillors and 23% of the vote. And the change in how seriously what I said was taken by the other parties was just monumental. Now, of course, there's the wider climate issues, but parties are now falling over themselves to pursue green policies, and now we've got more elected people in the room holding them to account when they say those words. So there is no such thing as a wasted vote. The next thing I'd say though is we do live in national elections. We have an incredibly screwed up electoral system, and so I had so many people come up to me at the general election and say, Jonathan, I'm just really torn between, I want to vote Tory to keep Corbyn out, or I want to vote Labour to keep the Tories out. But yet my heart says vote for you, and I think I like your policies, I like who you are as a person, but I'm not going to vote for you.
Must be very frustrating.
Well, I try and be very gracious because I understand I understand that kind of tearing feeling that we have because of the electoral system. But ultimately, I think if people want change, they have to vote for the change they want to see. And the other thing to say is, not only do people need to vote, they need to tell other people they need to vote. That is how you really have an influence. If you tell 5 or 6 of people around you who you're going to vote for, that has an influence, because people like to back a winner. They like to back the person that's got momentum. And so I think people underestimate the power they have in our democratic system to change things. And so, if everybody that kind of wanted to vote for the Green Party at the last election did, certainly Warwick District, I think we would have been up around that 20%. And we're right in, it could have been a 4-way battle in Warwick and Leamington. So, but people have to make that step. And I kind of really sympathise with people that I have to vote for my least worst option. But as a party, we have to try and deal with that, because the electoral system ain't changing anytime soon. The Conservatives have been very clear that they're not interested, and Labour refused to make any commitment on proportional representation. The only leadership candidate, Clive Lewis, who had publicly advocated PR, didn't even make it past the first hurdle. So as a party, again, we have to accept reality and go and make that case and find ways to win and win council seats, win European seats. Well, not for much longer.
Oh well.
And our influence will continue to grow, and hopefully we can show people that momentum is there, and that they can vote for the people they want to see in government and stand a chance of winning.
Could you not say that, so when you described it as the Green Party have had great influence in having, influencing other parties to adopt more green policies, which I would say is probably undoubtedly true. I mean, Labour have certainly done it, and even the Conservatives have done it to a great extent, actually, very impressively. Yeah. But would you not say that, okay, if that's the aim, is to push people to green policy, do you see an end goal for the existence of the Green Party? Do you see, right, finally every party has at least something acceptable? We are going to stop taking votes in the most to be a cynical view, to say, all right, fine, we're going to stop. We're going to try and let who we have a great chance at winning at this point from just going through, and will be assimilated by, for example, the Labour Party, or by the Lib Dems, or even the Conservatives. Do you see an end goal for the Green Party in terms of, right, this is now an accepted viewpoint, we're going to step out of the way, we're going to join one of the major parties? Or is it even just simply become an outside voice?
I don't think probably you would ask that question to any of the other parties. Do you imagine like dissolving yourself at a certain point?
I wish I could.
So, I think what I love about being in the Green Party is that we're very happy to give away our ideas, like things on living wage, which were completely off the table. We were the ones advocating it. But we've always got another idea once we've given our idea away. So we're always ready to say, OK, and here is the next step towards a sustainable and just society. So I don't see that changing anytime soon. And the other thing I'd say is that the power of that green voice in the room in making the decisions, really behind closed doors, that is making a massive difference. Just one or two Greens on a council and then a group, that influence. And so being an outside campaigning voice is fine, but we want to be in on the action where the decisions are being made, and for that we need people to vote for us so that we're elected, so we can be in those decision making situations.
You described yourself as a pragmatist earlier, and I think I would go with the question. So I think most people would accept that Labour's the last generation, their policies on green politics, particularly like the Green Industrial Revolution, was very strong, very in line with the Green Party. Would you not say that it would make sense for the Green Party to either very much strongly try and should have aimed for a coalition, or should have simply stepped out of the way in certain seats from a pragmatic viewpoint of, well, they're simply more likely to win, unfortunately. We should only be challenging in areas where they're less likely to win? Or is that something you would say that's ridiculous, and we still are our own voice in a sense?
Yeah, we are a political party with a distinct, philosophy, and so to not stand and to not have that opportunity to move the political debate, that is a bizarre thing, I think, to ask for a political party, unless there is a clear, well-defined negotiation and reason for standing aside in a particular seat, which is exactly what we did working with the Liberal Democrats and Plaid Cymru. And unfortunately, Labour just weren't interested in having that discussion, because they kind of just thought that we should stand aside without them even having that discussion. Understand that we would be giving something up. What would they be giving up? And so, as I say, I'm always happy to talk and work out whether there is something. The other thing about standing aside is I think it's a lot less simple. So, especially on the left, there's this kind of underlying assumption that all the people that vote for Lib Dems, Green and Labour are kind of basically the same, and they're not Tories. But that cannot be further from the truth. Like, on the doorstep, I met so many people that were saying, well, do you know what? I'm deciding between Conservative and Green because I really care about the environment, but I want, I don't know, I believe in small government or something, or I want Brexit or whatever it is. And likewise, there are people that might vote Liberal Democrat that would never vote Labour. But I think what I find is that people within the Labour movement find that really, really difficult to understand, because in their world it is Tory or not Tory, and so, but that's not how the electorate think. And so to assume that if we weren't to stand, all the votes would just come flocking over to Labour, that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how the electorate work. And actually, it's treating the electorate really poorly to think that that's how it works. And so I think that kind of mentality is something that the Labour movement needs to be thinking about how they address that in the future.
Well, fantastic. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for coming on. I'll give you a second now just for a quick sentence or two, a little bit of time, just to say what do you want people to do, or what would you suggest people should do individually? What is the best way, if they care about climate issues, to get involved and to spread the message, or simply to help in any way they can?
Yeah. Well, there's loads of opportunities within party politics. Obviously, can get involved in the Green Party locally. We're one of the most active parties in the country, so there's loads and loads of stuff going on policy, on action. But then there's also the climate strike movement, or I'd just say, whatever sphere you're interested in, whether it be business or something else, get out there and put your head above the parapet and advocate for change.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on, John. Everyone, please follow John on Twitter. It's at John Chilvers, I believe.
That's right.
Please follow him. This has been great. He tweets great climate stuff and occasionally retweets my thing telling about this show, so that's nice. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have anything you want to plug? Any last words for the dutiful future listeners?
Well, no, it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you very much for having me on. Thank
you so much. This has been great. I'm going to play our last song, which is by an artist called Barracuda, the song's called Charlie. Enjoy. Thank you very much.